So Joe，你现在就到了 Yellowknife， 也那个混上一工作，然后 OK， 然后你在那儿是一共待了几年
I stayed for about a year, a little less than a year actually.
然后是又去别的地儿了。
Yep.
OK， 那你先讲讲这一年怎么过的。
Yeah. So I'm in Yellowknife and I have a job, and I didn't have a place to live. So there's two local bars. It was a heavy drinking town, rural and northern Canada. There's a lot of alcohol. And so the local bar is also a kind of social center. It's a meeting place. It's a community center. So I went there and I'm sitting at a table. And in those days, the tables hold about maybe 5 or 6 people. So some people joined and left, and I'm sitting at a table with some people. I didn't even know them. I'm just sitting there, and this man comes up and said, "Can I join you?" He sits down, and I notice he's Inuit, and so we start talking, and I found out he is looking for a place to live as well. I'm looking for a place to live. And I just said, well, why don't we share a place? And first time I met him. And he said, yeah, sure. So, that's an example of part of the spirit of those times, is arrangements were very informal sometimes, very free, very trusting.
Yeah.
And it wasn't limited to white, middle-class kids like me. This man was an Inuit, born in the high Arctic of Canada, had moved south to Yellowknife. Here I was imagining I had moved far, far away to the north, and for him this was the south. Yellowknife was white man's world of the south. Also indigenous Indian, native people's world.
对于你来说，从渥太华或者蒙特利尔到 Yellowknife 是到一个很遥远的、挺边远的地方。对于他们来说，他们原来从在很靠北的那个更边远的地儿到 Yellowknife， 实际上是到一个城市，是一个大地方。
Yeah. And Yellowknife had, 5,000 or 6,000 people living there. It's a small town. Anyway, we looked in the little local newspaper. It had 2 pieces of paper folded together. That was the newspaper. And there was an ad for a cabin to rent. Cabin is a log cabin. So we contacted the person, and Peter and I got on. He had a skidoo. Skidoo is like a snowmobile.
Yeah.
But his skidoo was one of the first skidoos ever made. It was a very strange, simple-looking box. It made a lot of noise. And anyway, we sit on the back of his skidoo, and he drives out of town down to the waterfront. Yellowknife is on a big, big lake called Great Slave Lake. And Yellowknife started because a lot of people were, in the 30s, there was no road, but they discovered a gold mine. That was the reason for the town getting started in the first place. And the old historic 1930s gold miners' town was still there. And the planes would land on the water and pull up to the shore, and there's old houses. And part of it was like an island connected with a little bridge to the shore. And on that island was all Dene people. Dene is a nation of Canadian Indians, and the Dene occupy that part of the north around Yellowknife. And so there was mostly Dene people living on this island. And this cabin that we rented was on a Dene island. And I'm with what they used to call an Eskimo or an Inuit man. We're going to share this cabin together. So we see it and we bought it. I remember it was $60 a month. And
我问一句，你当时就是说你上次说找了一个工作，在那个 office 在那个办公室里边，你的工资是多少？
I don't remember. I don't remember. It was enough to live.
Okay.
Yeah. It's back, I don't know.
反正你可以足够你就是活下去，租个小房子，吃东西，反正就够了。
Yeah, for sure, and even save a bit. Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. And also this cabin was very, very cheap. And this cabin didn't have electricity for the heat. It was called a space heater. There's an oil tank on the back. You dump in the oil has a gravity flow into the house and into this metal box, and you put a match on the bottom. And
感觉有很多防火隐患。
Yeah, actually, it's pretty safe because this oil is very dense and sticky and it burns very slowly. But and then there's no plumbing. The toilet was a big bucket with a toilet seat on top, and there's no water. The water there's a big oil drum on the counter beside a sink, and on that island nobody had running. There was no sewer system and no water system. So there used to be a water truck would go by, and there was two pipes sticking out of your house, one for water in, and then the water would come out. So a water truck would go by every few days and dump some water in your drum that was sitting beside your sink in the kitchen, and your toilet had this bucket with a handle. You had to pick it up, carry it outside on the sidewalk. It was actually by the road.
就是我一个问题，就是那边冬天那么冷，什么零下30-40度的，那你那个保温那个 cabin 可以吗？
It was okay. It was logs, big wooden logs. It's a log cabin. Horizontal logs with some stuff in between. It was warm enough. But one time it got so cold, 55 degrees below zero for a few days. Like at night it went down that low. And our oil in the tank outside turned into jelly. It wouldn't flow.
Yeah.
And our cabin got cold. So what do? What we had to do was take some sticks, open the top of the oil tank, put a stick in and shake the stick and try to loosen up the jelly, and bang on the tank on the outside to try and turn it back into enough liquid so we could have some heat. And that worked. But it was 55 degrees below zero. It's really cold. But we survived. Also, one time there was a power failure later. In the winter, all the houses in the town, the new town, had electric pumps for the oil furnaces. If there's a power failure, the pump doesn't work, then the whole house starts freezing. No lights, nothing. But I came home one day from work during this power failure, and I'm looking at our cabin on the island, and the windows were full of light. I said, well, I knew Peter was home. His name was Peter Green, my roommate, and he had made Inuit oil lamps. In this like thousands of years old technology. You have an animal fat in a dish, and you have a little strip of a wick, and you light that.
就是小油灯。
Yeah, it's an oil lamp. Yeah, very simple oil lamp. He had taken every dish and saucer in our home, put it all around the place, put some kind of fat in all of them, and a little cloth wick, and lit them up. And it was like a fairyland. It was so beautiful. Just our cabin was blazing with light. It was a nice moment. Anyway, he and I shared this cabin on this island. And I walked to work every day, 20 minutes, half an hour to get to work. And later I met my next door neighbor across the street. Was a house with about, maybe 6 children. The children used to come to our cabin on Saturdays and play games, and I encouraged them to draw pictures, and used to roll our cigarettes for us. We had a can of tobacco and paper. They'd help us load up our supply of cigarettes. We're all smoking. So having these kids come over to our place was an interesting way of learning what was going on in the neighborhood. One of the young kids, he drew a picture of his father beating his mother with a stick. It's a very frightening picture. And the picture included him standing on the bed with his hands around his father's neck, trying to stop him from beating the mother. So domestic violence. And then another day, I was sleeping in the front room, and Peter had the bedroom. I slept in the living room on a couch, and there was a knock on the door. I let the person in. It was early in the morning, and he had a rifle in his hand. And I didn't know him, and he just wanted to sit for a while. He spoke a little bit of English. He was a Dene man, and so we chatted for a while, and he had some of our drinks, alcohol, and he left. And then half an hour later, another knock on the door. It's the police. I said, "Did you see a man here with a rifle?" I said, "Yeah." Where did he go? I don't know. So
it's a murder.
I learned later. I don't know if he killed somebody, but he had shot somebody in the stomach. So I don't know if they died or not. But and it's called a manhunt. Like airplanes and people were out looking for him. And they said he couldn't build a fire, otherwise that would give him away. So this this man was being chased there. So and when Peter in our home, Friday night, his friends would come visit with us, and he had one friend who made his living gambling at pool halls, betting the game, and both of them drank too much, and the more they drank, the more these sort of anger would come out, and they would start fighting, and they were really hitting each other very hard. And I used to hang my clothes on hooks on the wall, and they would get ripped down. And one time the stove turned over, and the window was broken, and so it was pretty scary. And even when he had been beaten up, Peter would get up and chase the guy out in the snow. And
what did Peter doing?
Peter worked in a warehouse, a government warehouse. But one thing that made me really, really happy, just this year, a bit earlier this year, this is like what, how many years later is it? 50, 60 years later. I wanted to get in touch with my friend Peter, and I looked it up online, and there was a huge article about him. He had died, last year. And it turned out that he was a hero. He had become one of the most important leaders of the north of Yellowknife, that part of Western Northwest Territories. Now it's a political unit, you could say. He became a champion of his people because the oil companies were coming in, doing deals with the government to drill for oil and so on. And Inuit people would say, "Hey, wait a minute, this is our land." So that whole story started there, and Peter was involved in negotiating successfully to get their participation and their sharing the wealth and so on, and protecting the environment, whatever. Those were the issues. This is in the 80s, maybe 15, 20 years later. He became a leader of his people. And this eulogy or obituary about him was full of praise for him and his work, and there's some photographs. So I was happy to hear that. And he had to relearn his language because he ended up in a residential school. And he was forbidden to speak his language, so he had to relearn it later. Anyway, that's a long story. But related to that was my neighbor. There was a young man about my age who grew up there, and he also turned out to be a leader. He was Dene, and he became the same thing with oil. And he got involved with helping his people have a better relationship with the development process. And he ended up becoming the head of the Federation of Dene people in Canada. And then he became the head of the Federation of all the Indian people of Canada. And then he became part of a royal commission to study the situation of Indigenous people in Canada. And that led to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that happened recently. So he became a very, very, he received like 7 honorary PhDs and the Order of Canada and whatever. So he was my next door neighbor. He was my age. It was and I'm saying that because at that time I had no clue, no idea about the experience of Indigenous people in Canada. And I'm grateful that I went to Yellowknife to have that experience because at least it's not something abstract and distant. It's real. Part of the reason I left school in the first place was some kind of almost a crisis, I guess, or like a feeling that was so strong that I didn't know why I was doing what I was doing. I wanted deeper understanding of why am I studying architecture? Why am I alive? What's going on in the world? And so it sometimes it overwhelmed me. Remember in those days, people were reading, like looking for spiritual input, spiritual information. I remember there was a famous teacher called Baba Ramdas. He was an American who adopted a Hindu name, and he became like a guru for the hippie generation. And he wrote books, and we were reading them. Some of them were like our Bible. So I remember I was reading one of his books one day and searching for the truth, looking for answers. And this book was very abstract. It was the title of the book was like "Be in the Moment." That was one of the themes of those days. You had to be natural, had to be
That's
real.
That's very Buddhist. 活在当下.
This man, he introduced us to a lot of Buddhism. Mm-hmm. And like the story of the monk who carried the woman across the river, that story was there. And and then the monk later criticized the old monk. The younger monk criticized the older monk. Why did you carry that woman? We're not supposed to do that. And he turns to the younger monk and says, "Are you still carrying her?" Like he had let it go. So that kind of thought was penetrating the hippie world deeply. Yeah. And then I was absorbed in that, reading this book, and I was sitting in a park that had a lake, and this blue-collar man walked by with a hard hat, obviously a worker, a construction worker probably from somewhere. And he had a big, bright smile on his face. "Hi, howdy neighbor, how are you?" And he walked by. And then, I just felt like he is already in the moment. And here I am, I'm outside of the moment because I'm trying to be in the moment so much. I'll never get there. It's like a dead end. So I had that thought, and I picked up the book and I threw it in the lake. Said, "This isn't working for me. These kind of books, these guru things. I liked the thought, but this wasn't getting me there." I remember another day I was in the office working, and I just felt overcome with a feeling of grief and sorrow. And I just had to go for a walk. So I just walked out of the office, and there was a church nearby. I remember sitting in the church, and I remember saying, "God, if you're there, please help me. I'm really confused. I need help." So a cry for help. I'd like to talk about another person I met in Yellowknife, a guy called Buzz Gibson. I found out he belonged to a religion called Baha'i. And he said nothing to me about it. But somehow I knew he was. But we used to get together every Friday night, listen to music, and I was drinking alcohol, and he was drinking Coke or something. But we became good friends. We were about the same age and liked each other. And I remember we were both happy in the summer of '69. The Americans had landed on the moon, and they sent back photographs. And both of us were kind of excited to see. This was the first time people on Earth had seen a picture of Earth from space. And it was this beautiful blue ball floating in the black space. And what are we fighting for? Cold War, what's going on? There's no boundaries drawn on that globe. It was a powerful moment. And anyway, I left Yellowknife in the fall to go to Nova Scotia to study art. I decided I would try that. And he was leaving Yellowknife as well. He went back to Toronto, he was from Midland, north of Toronto. He went back home, and I didn't see him again until the next year. So now I'm leaving Yellowknife, and I went I hitchhiked a lot of the way, and
That's far away from Yellowknife to Nova Scotia.
yep. Well, I flew to.
不过那时候你已经有点钱了，你工作了1年。
Yeah, I had money. Yeah, now I had some money and had saved some money. So actually, I flew to Edmonton. I think I hitchhiked from there to back to Montreal. Nova Scotia School of Art, that did not work out. That's a long story. I won't share it here. But I was feeling more and more distressed, or like this wasn't working, that wasn't working. I was still feeling lost, and I still didn't feel ready to go back to school. But I did go back to Montreal. Somehow Montreal is always my base, because I had friends here. So I went back to Montreal. In those days, it was still a custom, a possibility. You just drop in. Hi, I'm here. Can I sleep on your couch for a few days? That was acceptable. And I came back to Montreal.
我插一句 ，So all this time 你回到 Montreal 又去 Nova Scotia， 但是你一直没有回 Ottawa， 没有 visit your parents， 没回家看看。
I might have. I think I went back to Ottawa for Christmas that year, but very little. Actually, it's interesting you mentioned that. This is a side story. I just briefly mentioned that throughout this 3.5 years, for most of it, I ignored my parents, and I realized afterwards I hurt them deeply. You know, they're worried about their son. He quit school and he disappeared. Yeah, in those days, you know, it wasn't, you had to write letters. Telephone calls were expensive and so on, but that was no excuse. I could easily have written to them. So actually, that's an indication of how, maybe on one hand, maybe how selfish I was, how self-absorbed I was in my own problems, let's say. I had no bad feelings about them, but they just kind of faded into the background. I didn't have any anger towards them or resentment, nothing like that. I just forgot them. And later I learned how much I had hurt them, and I tried to make up for that. Maybe that's one of the reasons why recently now I'm going every month, 6 weeks. I would go to Ottawa and help Mom out. But now she's 104. When I came back to Montreal, I stayed with 2 old classmates, Peter Sipkus and Stuart Kinman, and they were sharing an apartment near us here on the plateau in Montreal. And that night I had 2 dreams, which I remember very well to this day. And in general, I don't dream very much at all, but those dreams for me were very important. So I'd like to share what those dreams were. They're not that long. The first dream was a light shining over a woman who was sad, sitting on a chair. And I went close to her to try to comfort her. And she pointed a finger in a direction. And I looked in the direction, and there was a circle of people who were giving off light. And they didn't have light shining on them. They were radiant people. And there was a space missing, almost like an invitation for me to join the circle. That was one dream. The other dream was there was a bird on the shore of an ocean who flew up in the air and tried to fly into the sun. But it got too hot, and his feathers start melting, and there's smoke coming out of his feathers. So he turns around and dives into the sea. And you can see him swooping under the water, and the bubbles streaming behind him, and there's big whales and things down there. But he can't breathe. He has to come back to the surface. So he's floating there. And birds can, in English we call it hovering. You can float on the air. If there's enough wind, the bird holds his wings out and he flies. So I did that, or this bird did that. Yeah, I guess for me, I am the bird. But anyway, the bird holds his wings out and doesn't try anything. He just lets the wind move him. And then As soon as he did that, his body started to get very, very large, and his wings sort of stretched from one end of the picture to the other, and he turned sideways. So one wing started to cover the sky, the other wing started to cover the ocean. As he got bigger, he got more and more transparent, translucent, and the feathers of the upper wing became the rays of the sun, and the feathers of the lower wing became the waves of the sea, and his body stretched out into a line, and then no bird, he's gone. So that was the dream. And I did not understand the dream then, and I understand it maybe better now. But the feeling from those dreams was like, Joe, stop worrying.